So welcome everybody to this presentation, but also a demo and a discussion. The topic of today is a presentation of the IMEF initiative, IMPA Environmental Footprint for IMPA Maritime Environmental Footprint. And the whole idea here is that we will do an introduction of the environmental footprint initiative. What is it all about? Mikael is going to make an introduction about the vision and the mission, and then I will dive into some of the reason why is this important, and then we will show actually a live demo where we make a calculation today. So we'll show in 5 easy steps how can you actually make a compliant calculation. And I think the reason why we're doing this is also to create a little bit of discussion. Is it really that difficult? Or what kind of obstacles do we actually have? And that we will do in a Q&A session. So we actually prepared some questions, but also would very much like some questions from you guys. But I think since we're not that many, should we do like around the table? Everybody can just introduce yourself. So I will pass on a microphone. Isn't that amazing? So if you can just say your name and where you're from, and then pass on the microphone to the next person. Then we do a little interaction thing, right?
Hello, I am Jeppe and I'm with Matrust.
Hi, my name is Silke. I'm with Wrist Ship Supply.
My name is Søren. I'm with Senwa.
I'm Charlie. I'm of Sinwa.
Hi, I'm Kenny. We're from a startup called Nara Project. We're building a supply chain management platform focusing on 4PL. And sustainability is an important topic for us, so it's really interesting. Nice to meet you all.
My name is Keith Key. I'm involved in corrosion and decarbonization.
Hi, my name's Marcus. I'm with Seatrade Maritime.
Hi, my name's Kevin. I'm with Francois Offshore Catering.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm from Francois Marine and Offshore.
Hi, it's Simon from Inchcape Shipping Services.
Hi, I'm Brandon from the Singapore Maritime Academy.
Hi, I'm John from Brusgard in Norway.
Hi, my name is Christian. I'm also from Brusgard, Norway. Hi.
Hi, I'm Yvonne. I'm from Maersk Singapore.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm from Marineko in Singapore. And we are actually a chemical distributor. So sustainability is very important to us. And we have a stand here today, so come and say hi.
Hi, I'm Mark. I'm from Remington.
Hi, my name is Jelle. I'm working at Vanos.
My name is Håvard, also from Vanos.
Hi, my name is Sigitas. I am from Maritexa Ship Services. We are suppliers in Baltics.
I'm TS from Singapore.
Yes, my name is Ahmad. I'm from Schemic Marine, Egypt.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane Peralta from Shell. We manage manage vessels, and we try to check the sustainability, how we can adapt that in the contract.
Hi, I'm Randy, also from Shell.
Hi, Ben Richardson. I'm the CEO of Solnox, which invents things to reduce fossil fuel consumption and emissions.
I'm Donald Trump, but they call me George Vasiliadis. And I'm coming back from 25 years experience in ship management. And at the moment, I set up GVS Global Vision Synergies.
Amazing. I think we got through everybody. Great to see you. Now we also got a chance to meet each other. I think, Dorthe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Dorthe. I work with Yvonne in Maersk. I've been with Maersk for 25 years, always involved in provisions, in consumables, now also in PPs, I'm working with a lot of you, and of course in Maersk with our journey towards carbon neutrality. Then of course this agenda is extremely important for us. But thank you all for coming.
And I'm Mikael Karlsson from Northern Marine, with a past at Francois, chairman of IMPA Save, and also been running very fast of getting this IMEF initiative established, along with my group, and hopefully soon a very large group of people that's going to join us. Yeah.
I'll get the mic back. My name is Rasmus. I'm the founder and CEO of ReFlow. I'm also part of the IMPA Safe Council. And I have the honors today to introduce the IMEF initiative, but also, as I mentioned earlier, explain a little bit about what are the reasoning behind it. Why is this here to stay? And we're also going to talk a little bit about different types of emissions. I will briefly get into some of the new EU legislation which is coming up. That's also fueling this initiative. And then I hope we will get a lot of skeptical questions because we have prepared some very nice answers, right? So, but I think actually first I would like to ask Mikael to give us a introduction into the IMEF initiative.
Yes, hello again. I don't know if many of you were on the call we had on Thursday. Raise your arms if you were on the webinar that we had. That's 1, 2, 3. Well, you're one of the 117 that attended it. So we got a ton of questions afterwards, which I'm going to challenge Rasmus on especially, and also you, Dorthe, a little bit later on. I'm not going to make a big speech about this, but in a nutshell, the vision here is for our industry to come together and agree on how we're going to calculate these Scope 3 emissions going forward. This is not going to be a sprint, but a very, very long marathon to get this right, and there will be a lot of errors on the road. But what we're trying and what we're aiming at is that ship chandlers, manufacturers, owners, managers, caterers, everyone in our ecosystem, the platforms, the ERP systems, everyone can agree on how we are going to do these calculations. Rasmus is going to be talking a lot about PCF today. Listen to that, because we're not looking for logistics right now. We're looking at the actual footprint of the products that we are selling to the likes of Maersk or to the Wilhelmsens, to the Stenas, from the likes of Sinwar or Rist, or even logistics services from you, Simon. So my vision is that we actually can collaborate and get together on this issue, because it's here to stay. And we're gonna, and I also want to say, this is not an EU initiative only. It does affect companies here in Singapore as well. So I'm not going to talk much more. I'll just leave it over to you, Rasmus. And
I think we're going to get back to you in a little bit, Mikael, and the same with you, Dorthe. So I have the honor to explain a little bit about the foundations, why this is important. And I hope that some of you might get out of this room later with a little bit better understanding of the whole notion behind the IMEF, but also get a better understanding of why is this and something called Scope 3 emissions and product carbon footprint here to stay. But also you know the difference. What is it all about, right? So there'll also be a little bit of education in this. So as I mentioned, my name is Rasmus Elsborg-Jensen. Let's now try and dive a little bit into the what is this all about? As Mikael mentioned, it's a vision, but it's also an initiative that will assist everybody in the maritime supply chain to actually talk the same language when it comes to carbon emissions. We are seeing a landscape of new initiatives, also from the European Union, which will make it, if we don't work together, more expensive, but also more complicated to do business. Our hope is here with this initiative is to start early, bringing us around the table and making it easy to make some learnings where it's okay to not do everything 100% correct. If we do not do this, and we fast forward in a year and a half from now, everybody will need to implement something like this within a few months. And we all know that it's expensive to implement certain things very fast. So the idea is, with this initiative, is that we get the learnings done. We bring the ship owners, we bring the equipment manufacturers, the ship chandlers, everybody together, and we make a joint language for calculating and sharing these carbon emissions between us, right? And of course, what we want to do is maximum output with least effort and least cost, right? That's the whole idea here. Now, before I move into what is it all about, the more technical part of it, let's try and look into what is carbon emissions. How many in here have heard about Scope 3 emissions before? Let's do a raise of hands. Yeah, so a little bit about half of you. Now, Scope 3 emissions is a way to account for emissions for a company. It's a company called Greenhouse Gas Protocol that many years ago came up with the idea of saying, okay, if a company has CO2 emissions, there might be some difference in these emissions. They're not all the same. So let's try and divide them into 3 different parts. If we look at something called Scope 1, which you see here in the middle, if you are a ship owner, that would be the fuel you combust from the engines you have on board. That would be the Scope 1. Or if you are a company who are manufacturing, if you have a generator or diesel generator, or you are welding and using gases and so on, that would be your Scope 1. Now there's also something called Scope 2. And the Scope 2 is emissions generated from electricity, heating or cooling, which is typically generated outside, and then you buy it in. So if you're a ship owner, this could be your shore power. But if you are a manufacturer, this will be the energy you consume in your production, which you buy from the power plant. And then we are looking at the last one, that's the Scope 3. Now, what is Scope 3? Well, that's actually quite easy. That's everything else. And why is Scope 3 so difficult? Well, as we look at this example up here, Scope 3 is emissions which are generated in your supply chain. So if you're a ship owner, this will be the emissions from everything except the fuel or the shore power. So as you can imagine, this will be the PPE equipment you buy. It will be the emissions generated from your yard stays. It will be emissions generated from the food the crew eats on board and everything else. Typical ship owner could have up to 2,000 different suppliers. So this is also a very big task for the ship owners to actually put numbers on this. And this is also why we're here, because if we don't get around the table today, we could risk that the ship owners are coming up with some initiatives of their own that are not compatible with the rest of us, or they are bringing down some consultants' good ideas, and then suddenly that will be what we all have to deliver on. So here we also have the chance to be around the table. Now, why is it that Scope 3 is on many people's lips, especially within the European Union? Well, if we look at the European Union initiative called CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Well, it's part of something the European Union came up with a few years ago called the Green Deal, a way of the European Union becoming greener, of course, but also carbon neutral by 55. And part of that is that they have a plan, and the plan is the CSRD, as you see here. They also have something called EU taxonomy, and then they have something called corporate sustainability due diligence. Now, the CSRD is a big game changer for many companies, also within the European Union, because it stipulates that companies now have to report on Scope 3. So if you are a company operating within the European Union, within the next 7 or 8 years, you'll have to report on this. Naturally, we cannot roll this out to everybody overnight. So what they have done is saying all the publicly traded companies over a certain size will have to report on this. And this is why the ship owners, at least in the European Union, are in challenge right now, because they are over that certain size. If you have a balance sheet over X amount of millions, then you have to report, and it doesn't take a lot of ships to get over that threshold. So now we know that this is important, but I also think we will dive into why it's also affecting other companies that are not situated in EU. Because the problem is that if you are dealing with ship owners or companies which are situated in the EU, you will most likely be asked to supply this emission data. So that's the whole thing, right? Now, it's also being rolled out over the next couple of years. So within, I think right now they say 8 years, 7, 8 years, to everybody who have a entity within the EU. And I think most of you in here actually have a sales office in the European Union, right? Or some kind of representation. So this will also be affecting those companies. Luckily enough, you have longer time because they're going to start from the top down in terms of size of companies. Now, I brought an example on what could this look like for a ship owner. What could the road to this EU compliance mean for a ship owner? And also a little bit of giving you an insight into why is it that they're suddenly reaching out to everybody. So let's look at this. So the road to the compliance is how we put it in 5 steps. The first one, let me see if I can get this one going. The first one is to make a gap analysis. So diving into what are they doing today and what will it take to be compliant. And then there is something in the European Union, I'll not dive into so many details, but they're also saying that besides reporting on Scope 3, they will also require companies to report on up to 1,200 other measuring points. And they have to integrate that into their financial statement. And that is a big thing. And the thing that companies can do to avoid reporting on all 1,200 of these reporting items is to conduct an assessment of what is material for them. So what is important for me as a ship owner is not necessarily the same as an engine manufacturer. So we all need to report on different things. But that is not saying you can deselect the Scope 3 emissions, but you might not need to report on water consumption unless it's material for you. So they undergo something called a double materiality assessment. And then we have seen almost every ship owner today are reporting their Scope 3 emissions using something called spend-based method. Now, the spend-based method is different from the IMEF initiative, and I'll explain why in a little bit. The spend-based method is all about making a calculation where you take your financial spend over the given fiscal year, and then you multiply it with a emission factor. So let's say you have $1,000 spent on a certain category. Then you'll have to dive in some databases, and there you might be lucky enough to find a relevant emission factor or find something which is close enough, and then you multiply it, and then you'll get a number of emissions, right? So if you find 3.3, it'll be 3,300 tons of CO2. Why do you think that might not be a good thing for most companies in the long run? Well, first of all, inflation. If the prices go up, or you buy more expensive products, or you buy greener products which cost a little bit more, or you buy higher quality products that cost a little bit more, then your emissions will go up. So as a ship owner, you will need to increase the amount of variables. You need to increase the amount of emission variables you have. And there you have to move into another way of calculating, and that's called the activity-based way. And that is what we will talk about today. It's a way where you look at the activities around producing a product. Instead of just looking at how much it costs and then you multiply it, the other way will look into what type of materials, what type of energy and how much, and so on and so on. And I'll actually do like a calculation on stage in a little bit. We can make calculation together. You can see that doesn't need to be very complicated. But of course it has some requirements, because now you actually need the data. You need to know what goes into the production of what you sell. Why is it the ship owners need that? Well, they need it in order to actually put a decarbonization strategy in place. If they don't know the emission footprint of what they're buying, they can't put a strategy in place saying we rather want this or that, or we should do this, or if we use less of this, we could do that. So they need more variables to put this in place. So this is also where once they do the transition from the scope 3, they go over and then they need some more specific data. But this is also where the supplier guidance come in, and this is what the whole IMEF initiative is all about. How do we actually, as a ship owner, have the right guidance to the suppliers in terms of how they should calculate and share this data? Now, before we move on, let me just look pretty quick on scope 3. Let's come up with an example. So this example here is a ship being built. Here you have multiple suppliers that are all supplying products to this vessel. And they are adding it to another supplier, which are adding their scope 1 and 2, and what they're buying of raw materials or have produced materials that they're putting together, and then they're installing it on the vessel. Now, the issue is here that if I was the company or the shipyard located there, I will need to know, in order to make my calculation, I'll need to know what I'm buying in order to have this data, in order to add my own data. If I don't have that, it will be a lot of guessing, and that will not necessarily work. But it could also work. We're going to look at that. But the idea is here to show that the emissions of a vessel is made out of multiple suppliers' product carbon footprint. And that's the difference between scope 3. So the scope 3 we learned a little bit earlier is the emissions generated within the company. Now, product carbon footprint is the emissions of the products you buy. Why is that different? Well, the product carbon footprint is all the materials or products you buy, and then that will be your scope 3. And then as a ship owner, you will add your shore power and your fuel consumption, and then you will have the full emissions of the vessel, right? That's how you're going to calculate it. Okay, let's see it in a real life example here. So here we have a cast iron foundry that are making calculations, and they are now using recycled cast iron in their production. They're able, in this case, to lower their emissions by, let's say, 20%. Then you have an OEM buying this cast iron, incorporating it into their product. Now, without them doing a whole lot than just sourcing some lower emission materials, they're now able to document that their product has a lower carbon footprint and share it with their customer. Of course, you also know that this is not what's happening today. And sometimes, as a ship chandler, you might have 5 tiers down, and you don't necessarily know who the producer is. So this will also be challenging. That's why we also say it's a good thing we're starting now and not in 2 years from now, because then we're going to be very busy. Great. Now let's see why scope 3 will increase in importance over time for the ship owner. So let's look at a vessel today. So this is an example of a vessel burning fossil fuel. This is what's called a life cycle calculation or illustration of the emissions of the vessel's life cycle. If we look from this example, 2.5 million tons CO2 within a given period. Let's say this is the lifetime of the vessel, let's say 20 years. Now, if we look and we calculate all the emissions, in this case, we will see that 92% is from the fuel consumption. And then you'll have 9% from shipbuilding and 0.5% in this case for the maintenance. And if you're fast, you can actually see there are some savings on the end of life. And that is if you have a good way of documenting the recycling of the vessel. Because once you recycle a vessel, you actually avoid producing of new steel somewhere, right? So now you're avoiding production of new materials somewhere if you can recycle the vessel properly. So this is how it looks today. And when we talk with a ship owner, of course, the fuel is very, very important. And this is the example why it is important right now. But we also know that the fuel is also very expensive to substitute, and it's very scarce in supply. Now, what happens if you add, in this case, green methanol to the vessel? Okay, in this case here, we reduce the overall emissions by 73%. That's a lot, right? But if you look at the remaining life cycle emissions, which are the same as before, we only changed the fuel, remember? Now you see the building process is suddenly increased. Now it's 30% of the entire emissions of the vessel. And the maintenance, now 4%. And you also see the end of life is also quite significant right now. Now, why is that? Well, we only changed the fuel and the other amount of emissions are remaining the same. So this, when we look at what is scope 3, well, scope 3 is the shipbuilding, it's the maintenance, and the end of life. So this is an example on why scope 3 will increase in importance, why scope 3 will be an integrated part of any ship owner's decarbonization strategy over the next couple of years. Because as they start switching their fuels, the next battlefield will be everything else. And that will be all of us. So that's why we need to figure out, sooner than later, how are we going to calculate these emissions? Because they're here to stay, and the ship owners will ask for them if they not already do that. So hopefully now we're on the same place and the same spot. Any questions? It's okay. If there is something that you need me to explain a little bit, I'll be happy to do it. Okay. No? Okay. We'll do a little bit later, another round. So how do you actually calculate? The IMEF initiative is all about calculating the emissions using the same method, the same database. Once you use these different approaches, you will have a number which is very similar to each other. Of course, not identical, because that will require you're producing the products absolutely identical with the same raw materials and so on. That's not the goal here. The IMEF initiative right now, in its form right now, is meant to help the ship owners creating a better starting point than what they have today. Because remember, right now they're doing the spend-based analysis, which is very uncertain. So by us starting early with the IMEF initiative, we are now providing a higher quality of data to the ship owners. We're not providing data, and I'll dive into that a little bit. We're not providing data which is good enough for the ship owners to make a comparison yet. There it will require much more sophisticated framework, and that is not the starting point of the IMEF initiative. It is a very simple way of calculating, which will be good enough for now for the ship owners. And then we can all learn together while we make it more complex within the next couple of years, so we actually adhere to all the international standards and so on, which are being developed as we speak. Okay, great. So how could a calculation look like? Well, this is an example of a calculation. Here we see a engine component. We see that it has some different emissions from the manufacturing, distribution, usage, and disposal. You also see down here that it has some different what we call parameters. So it has different emissions from different consumption to manufacture the product or distributing it. And this is the example. Yeah. Now I actually think I'm going to do something very daring. So I'm actually going to try and make a calculation together with you. This is always interesting to see if it will work. But I'm sure it will. Okay. Okay, we are now in a system. As a ship owner, ship chandler, or a OEM, there is a software for everything. That's how it is. So calculating carbon footprint, you can use different systems out there. And I think the whole idea with the IMEF initiative is not to adhere to a single provider, but to all agree on the way we calculate it, and then it's up to each of us to find a provider. Now let's try and make a calculation. In this case, I'll just see if I can turn this one on. Yep, I'll do that. Okay, let's try and make a quick calculation here. So what we're doing is any idea what should we calculate?
Yes, the ball valve.
Ball valve, good. So we will do that. Okay, so here we are looking at the weight of the valve. It's 200 kilos. It has a lifespan of 5 years. 5 years, yeah. Then there are some different things you can type in here. We're not going to dive into that. It's going to be a little bit complicated. But let's try and move on and look into the next step. So the next step is to calculate the emissions. But first you need to figure out what are you calculating. And the IMEF initiative in its form right now is only focusing on the production emissions to keep it more simple. You can also include a lot of other what we call life cycle stages of a product. If you click here, you can see there is a wide variety of different things you can calculate. In this case, it could be the manufacturing or the distribution, the usage of a product, and the maintenance, installation. All these different stages of a product life cycle is something you can calculate. And it's something that might be a benefit in calculating later on. But today, as the IMEF initiative is, we only focus on what's called cradle to gate, which is the manufacturing emissions. So we're gonna include that. Up here we're including the scope of emissions. So there we go. We're gonna dive in here. And now we are diving into the inventory. And in this case, I'm the producer of this ball valve, and I have no idea where my steel comes from. I haven't been able to reach my supplier and get their calculation on the steel. So what do? Well, what we can do within the IMEF initiative is to use what's called a background database. So a database which is compiled of millions of data points, which uses averages. So you can find the steel in this database, and then you will say, okay, using the bill of material, how many kilos do I actually use to produce this ball valve? Then you add that in the system. So in the first step with the IMEF initiative, you don't need to reach out to your suppliers. It will probably take time, right? So here you're able to make a calculation based on the consumption of the material. So in this case, we're gonna go into steel. We're gonna choose, let's say, cast iron. Gonna add it, and then we're gonna say it will probably be 200 kilos. Yeah, let's do that. We're using some energy to produce it, right? And we're using some medium voltage. And now this is the interesting part, because as you know with electricity, it has different emissions depending on where it's produced. But it could also be some of you are working either with suppliers or you're your supplier yourself, which are investing in green electricity. Now this could be a way to bring down your emissions on the production of your product, but you wouldn't know unless you make a calculation. In this case, I will say it's produced for this sake in Europe. And then you add the energy consumption. I'll put in 20 kilowatt hours. Are there any waste from the production? There will be a little bit of iron scrap. And in this case, we are, when we produce it, have about 15 kilos of iron scrap. Very good. We are now done with the calculation. So let's move on to getting the review of the data. And now we're gonna get a calculation. So now it's compiling the data. And with these 5 easy steps, you're actually calculating a compliant calculation and actually getting some data out. So the whole idea of bringing this up on stage is actually to show how easy it can be done. So now you have a calculation, 376 kilos of CO2 equivalents. You have calculating the manufacturing of the ball valve. You will see here the emissions from the cast iron. you will see the emissions from the electricity consumption. And if you added more materials or more types of energy or welding gases and so on, you'll be able to see it right in front of you. You'll then be able to see you have, now we look at the scopes I showed earlier, right? You don't have any fossil fuel or gas or anything in this production, but you have scope 2 from the electricity, and then you have the scope 3 from the steel. You see the breakdown here. And now you have your calculation. That's how simple it can be done. Well, it looks simple when I'm up here and we only use iron and electricity, I know. And now one of your questions might be, so what if I have 500 O-rings and I have a lot of complex stuff, or I have a cordless drill? How do I do then? And you can ask those questions up here. Right? Okay, great. Any questions so far to how you make the calculation? No? Okay, I think I will give the word back to the panel. Mikael and Dorthe.
Thank you, Rasmus. I've seen this presentation before, and I still learn something new. So I can imagine there's people out there sitting thinking, "What's this? How are we ever going to get started with this?" But that's why we're here for today and tomorrow to talk to you. The key message for me is that let's not go our own way doing this and have the likes of Maersk or even my company ask you different questions on how you want the calculations done, because been a ship chandler for 20 years, it's hard enough to source the right quality and have several qualities now. If you then also have to deliver different calculations every product you sell, I don't even want to get into that. So we have to find an agreement here that this is the best way forward together at IMEF. And what I didn't say before is that we are right now building a working group consisting of almost 20 members from known manufacturers such as Wärtsilä, MAN, and Viking Life Saving, alongside with Maersk, ourselves, Wilhelmsen, a few other ship owners and managers and caterers, alongside with platform providers, ERP systems, because you're going to have your calculations inside of these ERP systems to capture the data. Same with the platform. So there's a whole big ecosystem that has to be built to support you, so it doesn't have to be more unnecessary work. Rasmus is obviously from ReFlow and can provide help getting this data. And as always, or Rasmus says, there's probably more companies who can do the same. But the key here is to get a baseline, and this can be spend-based, which my company has done. I believe Dorthe's company has done at Maersk. But we want to have the right data, and there's only one way to get that, and that is doing the activity-based evaluation on this, and that's what we need to get to. So, I know there's a gentleman in here, I'm not going to say his name, but he did say he has a lot of stupid questions for me, and I said to him, I probably have a lot of stupid answers. So, and I do, probably. But
let's try and get some questions, right? Should we, who want to be the first to break the ice here? There's one down here. I'll run down with the microphone.
There you go, Rick.
I'll take a run. I missed the IMPA run, so...
Has to be the guy right in the middle, doesn't it?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I'm going to ask a stupid question. So, yeah, you can hear me, right? Yeah. Okay, so measuring is knowing, right? So this is where it starts. And as I said, this is a stupid question maybe. Would the software also be able to give recommendations on certain areas where to lower your CO2 emissions?
Yeah, that's not a stupid question. Yes, software can do that. I didn't dive into a big sales pitch today. That was not the whole idea. The idea was here to get a better understanding on how you can make the calculation. But yeah, there are, including the one I've shown here, a way you can dive in, a way you can look at what are the most emitting parts of my product, picking the low-hanging fruits, and then decarbonizing from there. So yeah, it's included in most software, including ours. So you can actually dive in and you'll get an overview and saying these are where you should start. Naturally, where you probably can start will not necessarily be the where it's easiest to start. There might be some big suppliers that are not ready that is being used for your product. But then, yeah, it's getting you a good idea. But the good thing about these types of software is you're able to do scenarios. So if you're a manufacturer, then you're able to actually say, what if I do this or that? Remember, you can actually change the data inside the calculation without actually changing the product itself. So you can actually go in and do different scenarios. Say, what if I produce in this country using that electricity? What if I produce in that country? What if I invest in solar panels on my factory roof? Let me just try and run a quick calculation. And then you can do the ROI, both on the cost, of course, but more importantly on the climate footprint. And you will actually be able to see, if I do this, will it then provide the necessary savings that we are looking for? So yeah, but I think the whole idea is let's start getting data driven, right? Let's put some numbers on this journey. Let's try and figure out where should we actually start, but also starting getting some numbers, because when you go around and you look not necessarily here, but on other exhibitions, you can save 20% and 10%. 10% of what, right? It's just percentages. We need to actually get some numbers on and start decarbonizing and actually working on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. If I were you, suppliers, I would be a little bit nervous about this calculation, and now I'm actually speaking against it. So I want a very good reply from you, Rasmus, because now I have Rest and Sinwa here, I have Venus, we have Brusgaard, we have a lot of people where we know we have direct competitors among them. How do I make sure that the supplier that I know, when Yvonne is out looking for suppliers, that you're actually reporting your numbers correctly? Is there some kind of audit? What if Rest is always lower than Sinwa? What if they're not doing the calculations correctly? What if, I mean, I can see a lot of ifs and buts. So I think it's a journey, but Rasmus, please let me know how we can make sure that, that we have audits. And Venus, you have a question down there also? Yeah, before you start, Rasmus, we have already started in our catalog in Maersk to have a column, 2 columns actually, where we have the carbon footprint. So right now, these days, we are getting the first carbon footprints in from suppliers. But again, where do we make sure, or how can we make sure that the what the suppliers submit is correct? And I would be nervous if suddenly I was a supplier and not knowing what my competitor was doing.
And I think you're right, spot on. And there are ways you can validate or certify a calculation. And in other industries, you can do that. There is ISO standards where you can certify your calculation in accordance with. But I think the big problem is it costs money. So if you are a ship chandler and you have 5,000 products and each certification and each product costs $3,000, and who's going to pay for that? The ship owner is not going to pay for it, right? So that's also why we're sitting around the table here, is to actually come up with some kind of a common language and start somewhere. So we don't have 500 ship owners coming out and say we want all certified calculations on all we buy from tomorrow. And that is, if we look at the auditors would have to audit these GHG greenhouse gas reports from the ship owners. That is their best scenario, is if everything is certified, because then they have no risk in certifying the report that they have to do, right? Because then there is a risk mitigation tool right there. So I think, yeah, there are ways, and you can also make much more complex calculations, and you can have a lot of more complex frameworks, and these are all being implemented right now in the aviation industry, automotive industry, and also in the building industry in Europe. And that is making life very tough for the SME segment, small, medium-sized enterprises, which cannot afford all these expensive certifications. So it's also, I think, from my personal view, is I would love to get tasked with certifying 3,000 products, but it's not going to happen. So we need to all agree on how do we actually proceed with a good enough approach together with the ship owners, that we put some quality mechanisms, and the lowest one I can come up with is transparency. What are you including and what are you not including in your calculation, with some kind of a documentation, right? But that's something I definitely think we should bring forward in the working group, so we can figure out what we're doing and how and why we're not doing it, and see if that's good enough for now. But yeah, what we do, I can just put it in, is from the platform you can actually include and trigger like we would like this to get validated, and then you have to upload all your documentation, and then from there will be an environmental engineer who is reviewing it and then logging it into a blockchain as documentation, and then it will be, you could say, certified, and then you could share that with your customer, but you're not sharing the documentation with the customer. That is something that is between you and who is certifying, because many times the needed documentation is IP. It basically has the entire recipe on how to make your product, right? So you don't want necessarily that out in the public. So that's why working with a certification or a certification body is needed. But yeah, it's definitely something that is increasing the cost and complexity to do this, and it is something that will be needed in the future. But I don't see the requirements right now in the current form of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, because how would you certify your spend-based emissions as a ship owner? You can't do that either, right? So we should just flip the question back to Dorthe and say, hi Dorthe, how is Maersk certifying their spend-based emissions today? And the short answer is probably not. So we're also starting somewhere.
I completely agree, and this is actually why you have to support this IMEF initiative that we have here, because then we'll agree on a playing ground. And we will have numbers reported from you. For now, we will not decide which supplier we will use according to the numbers you provide, but soon we will, as soon as we have found this common playing ground. So thank you, Rasmus.
That's probably me now. Yeah, you probably answered my questions. It's more on my thoughts are, how will you actually evaluate best in class when you're kind of averaging your calculation? You don't really have to go all the way back. You don't have to verify the components like you did with the steel now. We're doing like an average emission. We don't verify without verifying it. So if that's the base of this reporting, how do you put the suppliers apart if somebody's doing a really good job but they still can't, like, or they can provide documentation, and you have like worst in class but they do it on an average, so then like the difference isn't too much. So if that's like the base of averaging is good enough, then what's the incentive to actually be best in class?
Absolutely. I think it's spot on question. The goal of the IMEF initiative as it looks right now is not to create a output which is being used to compare products. Because this is not, again, if you're using averages, you can't compare the products, right? We're also missing a lot of mechanisms called product category rules. So there is already working frameworks within the European Union how to make these calculations. We're just not implementing them yet, because if you are to make a calculation following these guidelines and you'll have to hire engineers or somebody to do it, it will probably cost $10,000 to get it certified right now. But this will change with the software is getting more better and better over time. But these category rules is basically putting the rules in per product to say what are we accounting, including, and what are we not. So if you're using, for example, ceiling plates up here, well, are you including the wire it's hanging in, or you're not including the wire it's hanging in? Are you including the bracket, or just taking the panel itself? Now, this is the big problem for many other industries that does not have these product category rules, including ours right now. So this could also be another important part of getting it in. The other thing you mentioned is green claims. So if you are saying your product is greener, you cannot use averages. Your burden of proof is much higher, and this is the EU legislation saying that. They have something called a greenwashing initiative. And here they are saying, well, then you need something called a life cycle assessment. Because if you're claiming that your product is greener and you're just looking at your production, you might not get the full picture, right? Then the EU guidelines say, well, you have to including the maintenance and the end of life. And a great example is saying, okay, if we just have a vessel and we add tons of batteries, now it's zero emission. No, you are using scope 2 emissions from shore or from power, but what about the end of life of the batteries, right? So this is where we probably need to end with this IMEF initiative, is to get something more complex in 3-4 years. But it's also voluntary for the suppliers who are making green products. There's nothing saying that they can't invest in these assessments, in these calculations to actually prove it is greener products. And I'm sure you, Dorthe, if you get a supplier saying, okay, we have 30% lower emissions in our product, here's our documentation, I'm sure that she will not say, no, you need to make just a smaller quality calculation and I won't look at the savings. So I think it's up for the ones that have high ambitions to aim higher, and then for everybody else is to create a baseline which has a common ground.
I would like to start by saying, great, thank you for the initiative. I think it's wonderful. Well done to all of you, and we all know what it takes to undertake such initiatives. So we are thankful for you guys taking this initiative. You very rightly said that one of the main factors we all suffer somehow, and I say that in a positive way in shipping, is that some of us go our own direction, and you rightly said, let's try and get it in one direction or the right direction if there is a right one. My question to you guys is, do you have a wish list where you are saying, by the end of next year, I want to be there? And are you intending to get on board certain partners in certain areas to support you? Where are you heading and where are you going, so that those of us that are interested to have a plan and a vision and a target to meet moving forward? I think that's important to establish maybe from the beginning, so that more can pledge their support, more people can assist, and that may also support the initiative and give it more value. Thank you.
I'll try to answer the latter of what you were saying here, and thank you, George. Before we had the first webinar on this in London, we already had a small group of people getting together. Obviously, Dorthe has a bit of a head start on us because they've been working on the Scope 3 emissions for Maersk for years now, so we have a lot of knowledge from their side. So we don't have to start from scratch. But what we also realize is that a lot of companies, and especially ship centers all over the world, are not even aware that this is coming. Not even aware that they're dealing with European. They might think they're dealing with European companies, but I don't think that affects them because it's in the EU. What does it matter to me? But it does matter, because they're gonna have to have these calculations. If not, then they're gonna have to figure out what it is. And what hasn't been said here is, I've been in ship handling for 20 years, and today you talk quality price. That's what's being looked at, I guess, when decisions are made. Now you're going to quality, price, and emission. There will be a cost to that emission eventually, and I think the EU Fuel Directive in the EU is the first step at that, where you're now paying 50% of the EU fuel per ton of fuel you burn from the voyage into EU. I think they're going to take that learning and put that into effect with Scope 3 and Scope 2 as well down the line. So I think we have a head start with the group, which I also said that the working group so far it's a lot of people involved. It's not like we're going to sit around a table and sing Kumbaya, or everybody's going to get together all the time, but we are going to share information, and to get people to join will get them the information. It would get them the transparency. It would not, they wouldn't have to start all over with everything. There's a roadmap that we're building here to get this done. And this is also why I mentioned the whole ecosystem, platforms, ERP systems, suppliers, manufacturers, owners, managers, caterers, all have to get together. And we've got some pretty big ship owners already, and very big managers already, and big caterers that are on board with this, that will pull forward. And then it's up to whether everybody else follow. So that's my side of it. Rasmus, I don't know if you have comments to the first part.
I think if we're looking at what happened in the wind industry, so they came out with an initiative from the windmill producers to all their suppliers last year. And that initiative was, now you are supplying overnight the Scope 3, or you are not being chosen as a supplier. Everybody was in panic, right? And then they started supplying a lot of data. And when you look at the windmill production companies like Vestas and so on, Siemens Gamesa, they suddenly get flooded with a lot of data. But there was no consistency in how was it calculated, and so on and so on. So they spent a whole year in shifting through all this, and then they had to go back and say, oh, well, by the way, you need to calculate like this. And suddenly all the suppliers were now told what and how to invest in their platforms and everything. And in the past year, they already started their journey, right? So we want to avoid this. So I think part of the ambition and the roadmap will be that we agree on our roadmap and a pathway where everybody in the supply chain can actually make the right investments to begin with, but also have a saying in what pace it's being done in. So we all go in the same direction. I think that would be a very important path. And of course, if you look at it from the outside, harmonizing with existing standards and future standards, ISO standards, EU standards, and so on. So that's also helping mitigating the risk if we're going the wrong direction, right? So if we adhere to some of these standards down the line, then we might be in a safe spot. So so that's from my perspective the roadmap. But of course, as Mikael said, it's also part of the working group and everybody who is involved with this to put the roadmap together and get their voice out there and follow the transition and where we're going.
And if I may add, one of the initial idea and my vision is that when the working group just gets together, and obviously we all have some ideas from Maersk already, but discussing the data points, and we're not going to start with I think you mentioned over 100 data points, but we're not talking 100 data points, maybe just 5 or 6 on the product itself, just to get started. So we develop from there. So that initially that is the plan, not to make this whole thing so complicated, because it is a huge task ahead for every company.
No, just to thank you, and then from my point of view, personal point of view, is that we are all now looking into the future, all of us with no exception, and we need to decide likely today or tomorrow for the future. So it will be great as an observation to, show us the future, show us your targets so that we can engage and try and, engage with you as well. That's all. Thanks a lot. Yeah, great.
Thank you. Just going, any plans of, I'm 100% sure there's plans to make this more commercial. This is a starting point, as we all understand, and I do agree, need to find common ground, and as a supplier, we're really, really happy that you're trying to find a common ground. But have you put any thought into a factoring on a commercial base? So if you're comparing products based on the emissions and the pricing, have you thought about that? So you get like a combination of a cost emissions cost price thing, Imajik, if you understand what I'm saying?
I understand it clearly, and this is something I've talked about before, that today it's price quality only. The delta will be when the cost of emissions, which we don't know yet, and that's why I mentioned EU fuel. I think that's the first step in Europe where they're charging you for fuel consumed on a voyage into Europe based on distance you travel, and I think it's a per ton of fuel that you burn, where you can buy EU tokens today. And so I think they're gonna look at that when they start putting a tax on scope 3 emissions.
But I also think, Michael, it's also up to the individual ship owner and how they will balance cost, quality, and emissions in the future, and depending on the given situation, right? And if lower emission cost more, well, then you will definitely have some ship owners which are willing to pay more, right? So the example we're seeing today is you have a group of ship owners who came out earlier a couple of years ago and said, we have what's called a net zero goal within 2045 or 2040 or 2035. That net zero goal means that they now have to visualize a pathway on how they're going to reach this net zero. And the reason why it's called net zero is because they don't need to be zero emission. They need to do as good as they can, and then they have an option to buy these emission quotas for the rest, right? Now, the emission quotas, as Michael just talked about, will come with a price. So the difference between a little bit lower emission product that costs perhaps a small premium versus the buying of these quotas will be the mechanism for these ship owners in the future. So you might see some ship owners which are willing to pay X amount extra to get a lower emission product because the alternative will then to be a more expensive quota. Right, so that will be the mechanism we're going to see in the future. But it's important to say there's no regulations on these emissions yet. What we're seeing right now is the fuel, and it's a good place to start. But we're also seeing IMO expanding their way on how to calculate fuel to include scope 3 now, to include what's called well to wake. And that's also an indication that they're harmonizing with other frameworks right now to get a more clear picture.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback, but that's also, this is what makes it, as the companies here that are manufacturing, extremely complicated, because we can do whatever you want, but it all has consequences. It could have consequences on quality, price, emissions, everything. And if there's not a clear message from the ship owners, buyers, where do we go? So because we can make it with very low emissions, could have a quality effect. We could make it with really high emissions. It would last forever. So that's maybe my concern on this. It's not clear enough.
But let's compare it to going to the supermarket today, right? There are some consumers who want to pay a little bit more for organic products. And then there are consumers which are paying lowest cost for, you know, other products. So I think going forward, there will, of course, be ship owners which are valuing price more than emissions or quality. And then there will be the other ship owners. So it's up to you as a company to say, where do I think my customers are going? Where should my products go? And there you will also have to look at saying there might be some products will have a greener or lower carbon footprint in the premium segment, and then there will be some lower cost products for the other ship owners. But that's part of your business side. But before you can do that, you need to put the numbers on and get that idea of where do I actually start. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, if I can have one more. So in this, when we get the numbers in and everybody's on board, are you planning to look at maybe levels? So you get in like a comparable product. You had an example up there. Could you go on different tiers, different certifications, like your class A, B, C? You're looking at that, or is it just let's get the numbers and we have numbers?
you need to get the numbers. That's very clear. If you want to stay in business with European owners that I know you currently have. I think, if I understand it correctly, and I'll just translate this for a ship supplier who can have, let's say, 2 different drills. One high quality, one low quality, if there's such a word. You would get 2 different emission points likely, or maybe not. But that depends on how much in the details you want to go. And with this, you can get as many details as you want. And this is also why it's very important to clarify. Let's not, because you can, add a lot of data points that goes beyond what we're proposing at IMEF, because then you get maybe too much emissions compared to everyone else. So this is why this is going to happen, whether we like it or not. Now it's just agreeing on how we're going to do it. And that's what we are proposing here. So we do not have owner B or A, C asking for different calculations, different data, because that one, it would kill everybody. Everybody's going to break their necks.
I also think another important part is if you're looking at a scenario where you have enough quality on your calculation to compare products, like you're mentioning there, you are probably 4 or 5 years ahead of right now. So in the most advanced industries right now, they don't even do that and can't do it because they don't have these rules that we talked about earlier, because that will have to go down on each product level. So we are far away from there. But if that's where the working group and the initiative want to go, then there are a lot of steps we need to take. But that's also, if we're going too fast, we will lose a lot of the smaller suppliers or a lot of ship chandlers which are not ready. And then they will have, like we're seeing now with the whole IMO, CII and all these other initiatives, you'll have ships which are not longer within the score. And then we will lose a lot of things, a lot of products and suppliers. And that's not the whole idea about this initiative. This initiative is all about getting on the same page and getting ahead of the curve. But I don't see from the talks we have had so far that the end goal is putting A, B, and C labels on all products. There might be ship owners which want to do that internally in their buying process, but that's not the idea with this initiative. There was one here.
Yeah, I just want to say I think this is a fantastic initiative. I'm sure we'll be hopefully talking about this every year, because what I see, we do a lot of activity-based reporting because we found the spend-based wasn't nearly good enough. Fortunately, on the port agency side, it's maybe a little bit more straightforward because we've managed to do it on really crew change activities. I think if you're on the manufacturing side, that is really tough. You made the point before as well, a lot of us work with SMEs. We're never going to be able to expect them in the short term to come up with the data. So what was good about your platform is you can make some assumptions, but that's the issue as well, isn't it? The issue we've got, we're pretty sure that the calculations we make across a number of services in about 50 ports around the world are accurate, but we've got no way of going to the customer and saying, actually, this is verified, this is what you should believe, because somebody else may get verification from somewhere else that has calculated in a different way. The other issue we see is we take this to a number of customers, but the customers at the moment either don't see it as an issue or don't really know what to do with the data either. So my question to you guys is, when do you think that will happen? We've got one customer who takes it and we know plugs it into their system, but the rest of it go, well, that's really great. We'll just, come back to us next year when we've worked out what we need to do.
I think, Dorthe, we talked about something, right? In your catalogs, are you preparing for this?
Yeah, as I said before, we have already put in columns now that we can absorb it and we can have it displayed in our new system that goes live in 25. So we are kind of ready for it. But again, we are in initial stages and everything is new to us as well. But we want to be ready for it. We are, as I said, we are in the process of buying a new system. And that was one of the requirements. We need to have that data, places to display this data available.
I think from my side, the good advice is start small. If you're starting this journey as a company and you're manufacturing products, or you want to get in this with the carbon footprints, start small, try it out, get feedback from your closest customers that you think this is important for, and don't make a big project and think you need to start with all your products at once. Just start small and try it out. And I know I should have said you need to buy a lot of calculations, right? But that's not what's working. That is all the small stuff, because there's also change management within your own organization, as well as the suppliers you have.
Thank you, Simon. I think that was the last question. I have a ton of questions here from our webinar on Thursday. We're gonna publish that hopefully this week. Do you have questions? Come and see us. We have a stand here, the IMPA Safe stand. We will be around or walk around. Just stop us.
Yeah.
Ask questions. I mean, as Rick wrote me the other day, there's no stupid questions. And if there is such a thing, then I have a lot of stupid answers. So I'll repeat that.
That's good.
So thank you for coming, listening, and supporting. Sign up.